stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the manfromleng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am reviewing the Rogue cards in Union and Disillusion, the 4th Mythos pack in the Circle Undone cycle. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. A big thank you to the patrons of this channel for their tremendous support. If you'd like to become a patron to support the channel's goals and see your name on this list, follow the link down below and sign up for a tier and claim your rewards. The first Rogue card in the pack is Investments. It's a 1-cost asset with an intellect skill icon and the connection trait. It enters play with 0 supplies, and there is a limit of 10 supplies on investments. As a free triggered ability, you may place 1 supply on investments. As an action, you may exhaust and discard investments to move all supplies from it to your resource pool as resources. Here's a card that's generating a fair amount of debate over at Arkham DB. Some players are singing this card's praises, claiming it's another great resource generation for the Rogue class. Others argue this card won't see much play because the window in which to play it and consequently benefit from its ability is too narrow. Let's take a closer look at this card and find out for ourselves. First off, Investment seems as though it was designed with Preston Fairmont firmly in mind. That shouldn't come as too much of a surprise given that Preston is the rogue investigator for this cycle and he is a millionaire. Now, when Preston gains 1 or more resources from a card effect, his ability forces him to place them on family inheritance instead of his resource pool. However, Investments gets around this restriction because when you exhaust and discard it, you move supplies from it to a resource pool rather than gain resources. I'm fairly certain that Investments is the only resource generation card that operates this way, which sets it apart from traditional resource generation effects such as Emergency Cash, Lone Wolf, and Hot Streak. So with that in mind, let's address Investments' timing issues. If Investments is going to pay off, it needs to hit the table fairly early during a scenario. If you play Investments on turn 1, for example, the earliest you may cash them in to turn a small profit is turn 5. Why turn 5? Well, if you pay 1 resource and take an action to play it turn 1, you may exhaust it that turn to place a supply on it. On the second and third turns, you may exhaust it again to place another 2 supplies. If you cash in Investments on the following turn, that is turn 4, you've spent 2 actions to net 2 resources. You haven't turned a profit yet, since you could have generated the same number of resources simply by taking 2 actions at any point during those 4 turns. That is, of course, in addition to the resources you gained during the preceding upkeep phases. If you place another supply on Investments on turn 4 and cash in Investments on turn 5, you've taken 2 actions to gain 3 resources, or roughly 1.5 resources per action. You turned a small profit, however, you could have generated the same amount of resources in fewer actions if you had played a single copy of Emergency Cash. If Investments is going to pull its weight, you really need to put off cashing in the card as long as possible. If you're able to hang on until turn 8, for example, you net 6 resources for 2 actions, that is roughly 3 resources per action, which is the equivalent of playing 2 copies of Emergency Cash during a scenario. I say roughly because playing 2 copies of Emergency Cash does cost you 2 cards, while Investments costs you only 1. But that's a whole action card resource debate. That is a rabbit hole I have no intention of going down in this episode. So we've established that Investments takes a long time to pay off. That's fine as long as you don't happen to need the resources immediately. Preston generates 4 resources per turn with family inheritance, so he's in a better position than most investigators to leave his investments well enough alone and let them rack up the supply tokens. It's worth noting that Investments requires you to take 2 actions to trigger its effect, 1 toward the beginning of the game when you play Investments and 1 towards the end when you cash in. At the beginning of scenarios, I think most players tend to play cards that will set them up to deal with whatever the encounter deck will throw at them. Powerful allies and weapons take priority because they are a hard counter to what the encounter deck is trying to do. I think we can all agree that Investments is not a high-impact card, so it's likely to take a back seat to cards with more powerful effects during those critical opening turns. but delaying investments too long ultimately hurts what the card is trying to do. Investments also assumes that you've got a spare action toward the end of a scenario to move the supplies from it to your resource pool. Investments has the potential to generate a lot of resources given enough time, but those resources aren't going to do you much good unless you take the action to move them to your resource pool. Again, in my experience, spare actions tend to be in short supply toward the end of scenarios because investigators are usually fighting for their lives. Low on supplies and surrounded by enemies, investigators need to make every action count. There will be times when you simply can't afford to take the tempo hit to make a detour to the bank to cash in your investments. That puts investments in an awkward position. You need to play it early, but it's unlikely to take priority over other more powerful effects, and you need to wait as long as possible before cashing in, but you can't wait too long because you may find yourself in a position where you've got too much to do and too few actions to do it. Neither of these issues makes the card unplayable, however they do have the potential to make it inconsistent, since your ability to play the card and cash in depends on what's going on in the scenario. Investments generates resources slowly, but there are a couple of ways that you may try to speed up the process. Investments uses supplies, so you may target it with either level of Contraband from the Dunwich Legacy cycle or Emergency Cash 3. Contraband 0 and Contraband 2 will double the number of supply tokens on an asset, but both cards are quite expensive in their own right, which will eat into your profits. Let's assume you wait until turn 5 to play Contraband 2 on your investments. At this point there are 8 supply tokens on it, but you've spent 4 resources and 3 actions for them. That's not much of a profit. It's also important to note that both versions of Contraband have the illicit trait, so they're not an option if you're playing Preston Fairmont. Emergency Cash 3 is a better option since it will add 4 supply tokens to investments for free. If you play Emergency Cash 3 on turn 5, then cash in investments, you've spent 3 actions to net 7 resources. That's a much better rate of return, although you've got to spend 3 to 6 experience points for it. Personally, investment's finicky timing, coupled with its action requirements, make me a little wary of this card. Generally speaking, I like cards that make an immediate impact on the board state, and investments is not that type of card. Once you play it, you need to wait a long time before it pays off in any significant way. That sort of playstyle is at odds with the very nature of the Arkham Horror LCG, in which time feels as though it's often in short supply. The typical scenario is a sprint that you want to finish as quickly as possible, because the longer it takes to reach the finish line, the greater the likelihood you'll get crushed under the mounting weight of the encounter deck. When I play solo, most games last 10 to 12 turns. That doesn't give you much in the way of wiggle room in order to play investments. It needs to hit the table very early, otherwise there won't be enough time for the supplies to tick up. Investments has a lot of potential, but realizing that potential could be tricky. The second rogue card in the pack is Decoy. It's a 2-cost rogue event with 2 agility skill icons and the favor and service traits. It has the game text Evade. Automatically evade a non-elite enemy at your location. Response: when you play Decoy, increase its costs by 2, change a non-elite enemy to up to 2 non-elite enemies. And response: when you play Decoy, increase its costs by 2, change at your location to at a location up to 2 connections away. Decoy was spoiled in FFG's preview article, and it's the second card this cycle, the first being Intel Report from the Secret Name, that gives investigators the option of spending additional resources to trigger additional effects. Decoy does a bunch of things that are either rare or break new ground in the Arkham Horror LCG. First, it lets you evade any non-elite enemy at your location without requiring a skill test for 2 resources. I was surprised to discover this type of ability is still fairly rare in the game. Cunning Distraction, a survivor event from the core set, lets you automatically evade all enemies at your location, but it does cost 5 resources. Stray Cat, a survivor asset from the core set, lets you automatically evade any enemy, but you need to discard the Stray Cat. Besides those 2 cards, there is Cheap Shot, a rogue event from A Phantom of Truth. It will let you evade an enemy that is not engaged with you, but only if you succeed by 2 or more on a combat skill test during a fight action against that enemy. Impromptu Barrier, a survivor event from Shattered Aeons, also lets you evade an enemy that is not engaged with you, but again, you need to pass an agility skill test during an evade action against another enemy. It's worth noting that all of the cards I've discussed let you evade elite and non-elite enemies. Decoy is limited to non-elite enemies, so it's not going to get you out of every jam. While Decoy's first ability is rare, its two responses explore the design space opened up by Intel Report. Decoy's first response lets you spend 2 additional resources to change non-elite enemy to up to 2 non-elite enemies. If you spend 2 resources to trigger Decoy's second response, the enemy or enemies you evade may be at locations up to 2 connections away. We've never been able to evade an enemy at a different location before, which is pretty cool. The beauty of Decoy is that you may trigger both responses if you wish, spending a total of 6 resources to automatically evade up to 2 non-elite enemies at a location up to 2 connections away. If your rogue investigator gets cut off from the group somehow, you can still reach out and lock down a couple of enemies for a turn. You could also use it to handle one of the most difficult situations in the game, avoiding the cultists that have congregated at the main path in the Devourer below. Spending 4 to 6 resources to trigger Decoy's additional abilities is going to hit your resource pool pretty hard, so I wouldn't put this card in my deck unless I knew I had the resource generation to support it. While there are a few rogues out there, namely Preston Fairmont and Jenny Barnes, who can probably afford to drop Decoy, other rogues will likely need some help. I'm intrigued by Decoy. Automatically evading an enemy without having to make a skill test is a rare ability. Having the option to automatically evade 2 enemies or automatically evade an enemy at a location up to 2 connections away is almost unheard of. I can think of at least one scenario, the Devourer below, where that sort of ability would come in extremely handy, and I'm sure players will discover others once this card becomes available. I think it's very interesting that this pack contains both Warning Shot and Decoy, which will help you at the main path and those cultists. Decoy is one of the most expensive events in the game if you go all in, but there are a couple of rogues who will slap down 6 resources for this without blinking an eye. I haven't had a chance to play with these additional cost cards yet, so it will be interesting to see whether they gain any traction. Intel Report has certainly seen a lot of play in not only Preston and Jenny, but also Skids, Finn, and some off-class rogues as well. I doubt Decoy will be as popular as Intel Report, since Intel Report helps you discover clues, but Decoy can be a powerful tool if you're playing the evasion game. That's going to do it for my review of the rogue cards in Union and Disillusion. This pack's okay for rogue players. Both cards seem to be designed with Preston Fairmont in mind, but there's nothing stopping other rogues or off-class rogue investigators from using these cards. Investments has the potential to generate a lot of resources given enough time. However, it does take at least 5 turns before it really starts to pay off. That time commitment, coupled with the actions required to use it, make me question whether it will be consistent enough to make the cut in my decks. As for Decoy, automatically evading multiple enemies at connecting locations hasn't been an option up to this point, so the card does break some new ground. You'll need a solid resource generation engine in place if you plan on triggering both its responses, and that may limit this card to the wealthiest investigators. I do have a soft spot, though, for evasion-based builds, though, so I am looking forward to taking Decoy for a spin in the near future. That's going to do it for this review. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. You may also want to consider becoming a patron of the channel over at patreon.com. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.